afternoon, everyone. So I've just gone down to the Chinese shop to order dinner. Walking back to my car, Christina, and something's been on my mind the last few days. For those of you who live in Australia, you'll know that it's been awfully hot the last few days. Because it's been so hot, obviously anybody who's driving a turbo car is obviously stressing and sweating about, is their car overheating, performance is being lost, and how's everything being treated with the car. So for me, the thing that has been on my mind is all about charge temps. So I thought it might be a good opportunity for a quick vlog on charge temps with the turbo car. So what I'll do is I'll just jump over to the car, have a quick look at what my setup is to mitigate for hot weather, and we'll go from there. Right, so I've just jumped in the car, and today's not as hot as what it has been previous days, but as I said before, the weather's been really hot lately, so that means anyone driving a turbo car will be suffering and feeling the pain. The way a lot of us, obviously factory Subarus, they come with, Subaru all drive, STI and WRX, they come with a factory intercooler, which is a great solution for keeping your charge temps down. But obviously if the ambient temperature is super high already, and we're talking 40 degrees, higher than 60% humidity, the intercooler doesn't do that much. Now, with the Subaru, one of the biggest problems they have is what's called a top mount intercooler. The top mount intercooler actually sits above the motor in the engine bay, which means it's subject to all of the ambient temperature that is generated by the engine itself, which means your intercooler is already subject to a huge amount of heat. It's designed to discard heat, or to get rid of heat from your charge air temperatures. But unless it has good airflow through that intercooler, it is always going to still produce quite hot air. So when you're sitting at idle, for example, you're not getting any airflow through your intercooler. Your intercooler is sitting within a hot engine bay, and on a Subaru it's even worse because it's at the top of a hot engine bay, hot air rises. Those charge temperatures are going to be astronomical. I've seen them, when I'm monitoring my charge temps, I've seen them upwards 60, 70, 80 degrees even. And I've heard horror stories of people having charge temperatures of 90 degrees, and basically your car's completely gutless at that level. So a lot of other cars, non-Subaru cars, have what's called a front mount intercooler. Front mount intercoolers are generally better because they're sitting behind the radiator at the front of the engine, so they're not subject to engine bay temperatures, which means the ambient air around the front of the car is generally less than the temperature inside the hood, which means your front mount setup will generally produce lower charge temps anyway. So a lot of people, a quick and easy solution for fixing the charge temp issue with the Subaru is just to move your factory intercooler out to the front, and you do get a bit of a performance gain. Now when you're talking huge numbers, so when you're talking about a built motor, in my case, you're running high compression, big turbo, lots of power, the charge temps are going to be critical to keeping that power in the range that the engine's designed to be built on, and it's tuned for. But just because you've got a top mount, now I'm a bit unconventional in the fact that I refuse to get rid of my top mount. I believe that a Subaru needs a top mount. I know that it's just a hang-up, and most people would say, oh, forget about it, don't worry about it, go the front mount. But I believe that my Subaru retains some degree of personality with its top mount intercooler. So, of course, I'm trying to keep my top mount. I want to keep my top mount. And I want that, for another reason, that functional hood scoop that so seldom cars have nowadays. A lot of people have hood scoops on their cars, but they're non-functional. They just sit there and they look pretty. Whereas on the Subaru, they actually do a job. They cool down those charge temps. Now, the top mount works really well, providing you're moving. That ram on the front of your Subaru hood forces a good amount of air through that intercooler. It is ducted correctly, and it does flow directly over it, which means when you're moving at speed, you are going to be able to produce good charge temps from your Subaru motor. But when you're talking about lower speeds, start stops, high RPM, even autocross or those sorts of slow speed track conditions, the front mount is a much better solution, and the Subarus suffer in accordance with that. Why don't I just quickly show you my current setup so that you get a better understanding and appreciation of how this whole setup works, and then we can discuss what other options are available out there. So here's Christina. I've popped the hood already, and we'll just swing around the front. So when you're talking about a front mount setup on your car, which is what non-Subarus generally have, they would have an intercooler sitting in this area down the bottom here, or sitting behind your front grille. Now, because that is not subject to engine temperatures, it's subject more to ambient temperature, you do get a much better cooling effect when the car's not moving. However, when the car is moving and you've got good airflow through the front or through the hood vent, the hood scoop at the top there, then it kind of doesn't matter because the charge temps will all be about the same. So let's pop the hood quickly. So obviously on a Subaru, you have this hood vent at the top here, and this hood scoop, as it goes in behind there, sits your intercooler. So if I push this camera just in there, you'll see it's got great ventilation and ducting, and if you follow that through down to the back of the intercooler, back of the venting, you can see my intercooler sitting there already. So if I pull this slightly out, you'll see that that venting is sitting there nicely, and that's the way the hood duct or intercooler duct sits in the front. Now I've got a slightly better increase in airflow over my intercooler because I've installed a top mount intercooler guide. It's called an IC guide, which is this little component part here. Now it doesn't look like much, but this extra lip on here and the extra angle of attack that it puts onto the hood vent does increase the amount of air significantly that goes into that vent, which means my charge temps are slightly better, and they do pick them up quicker. So it reduces the charge temps quicker because you're getting more air at slower speeds through that vent. If we open up the hood, there we go. If I can find that horrible latch. So under the hood here we've got our intercooler. Now this is my intercooler. It's slightly bigger than your standard intercoolers that you'd get on a normal STI. It's definitely deeper, and it's definitely thicker. Now this is actually quite critical. So if you have a look at the side of this intercooler, you can see that there is, it's about, what are we talking, maybe 25 centimeters thick. So the amount of volume sitting inside that is quite substantial. So the way the intercooler works is you'll actually have your air coming from your turbo, your charged air, that pumps directly through this intercooler. What happens to the contrary is the air will pass through this duct at the top here, and as it goes through that duct, it comes out the back here, and that duct clips on to the top of the intercooler. So what happens is the air will flow through these tiny little grills or holes you have here, and as the air passes through these tiny little holes and goes through the intercooler and out the back, it will collect as much residual heat as it can from the surface area of these metal parts. So these metal parts will heat up because of the air inside of this intercooler, and as the air passes through, it takes that air that's radiating through these metal parts, and then blow them out the bottom, and that'll effectively take the heat outside, take the heat away from the metal, which would ultimately leave you with cooler air inside the intercooler. So when it comes out of the intercooler itself and comes into your manifold to go into your engine, it will be a much cooler temperature than what it was when it came through the entire turbo setup. So what have I done to improve the charge temps. So the one thing that I've obviously done is got the bigger intercooler. The bigger intercooler helps significantly. There is some anecdotal evidence that says black intercoolers help a little bit, but you know, you're talking about radiant temperature, so it shouldn't really make much of a difference if it's black or not, theoretically speaking. What I've also done, which a lot of people do, and was actually factory standard on most STI models prior to 07, is connected what's called a top mount intercooler spray system. So what this does is connected to my windscreen wiper bottle is a valve and a pump which would pump water up into this pipe here, and this pipe actually goes up in here into my bonnet. Now the other side of this pipe is going into my windscreen wiper jets, but the valve that I've installed, which is now hooked up to my turbo via a vacuum line, this when the turbo hits 10 psi, it actually pushes air through that vacuum line. That activates a solenoid, which clicks the valve over to start pumping water into this line. That line runs behind the hood liner here, and goes into this, and right in here, facing in an upwards direction, into my engine, to my thing here. You'll see this one little nozzle here, and another little nozzle just there. That sprays an atomized mixture of air and water into this this cavity in the hood vent, in the hood scoop. So that means that the air coming out of here, which is ultimately passing through this intercooler, has now charged full of atomized or misted water. Now water has a much better conductive properties than just air, so when your water hits the hot intercooler, it'll evaporate. When it evaporates, it draws a huge amount of extra temperature out of the intercooler, which means that, again, ultimately, the more temperature you draw out of this intercooler, the more your temperature you're drawing out of your charge temperatures, and the cooler the air is going into your engine. And as you know, the cooler the engine air temperature is, the more dense that air is, the more dense it is, the more air you get into your cylinder. The more air you get into your cylinder, the more power you produce. So getting those charge temperatures down is important. Now, on a hot day, the disadvantage of my system is, yes, I've got the water, which is more thermally efficient in pulling the heat out of that intercooler. The downside is that my source of the water is also in my engine bay, which means this water, although it's somewhat insulated, as you can see, it's sort of separate from the rest of the engine bay, but the source of this water is also sometimes potentially going to be quite hot. Now with water that doesn't matter too much, because the water does evaporate, and evaporative cooling, you know, it's just like when you're wet and you come out of the ocean and the wind blows on you, you feel much cooler, because that's the way it works. So you do get a much better cooling effect from the water, just simply because the water has good radiative properties, or thermal capacity, so it can take a lot of temperature out, even if the water itself is actually hot. And the fact that it's being atomized and sprayed up here, that also makes a big difference too. But it could be improved. Now there's I mean, like I said, a front mount would definitely improve. If you had a water injection system on a front mount intercooler, it goes without saying that you'd have a much cooler temperature in your motor. You know, that's probably the most effective, simple, quick and easy solution that most and I would say a lot of Subaru owners will actually employ to reduce their charge temperatures. However, there is something else that's very new to the market, which I'll get into in a moment. So we'll just wrap it up here for now. I'll shut the engine bay, I'll go around pick up my Chinese food, which should be ready, and then we'll have a chat about what new whiz-bang technology is out there that you can use to improve your charge temps. Alright, back on board. Just gonna go and swing by Jan's Chinese and Malaysian. By the way, that's the best Chinese and Malaysian that I've ever come across in my life. I don't know what she's doing to that food, putting crack cocaine in it or something, but it's bloody good Chinese food. So I'm just gonna swing around to Jan's, pick up the Chinese, and then to the house about what options are available on the market for reducing your temperatures. Alright, so I guess an important factor to think or to know at least about a turbocharged car around charge temps in particular is the fact that it is turbocharged, which means the way your engine is compressing the air that goes into your cylinder is via the scavenge cycle on your cylinder. So when you're pushing exhaust out of your engine, so when you're pulling exhaust out of your engine, that exhaust is going into the turbo. That's spooling it up, driving a compressor, and that compressor is compressing the air that goes into your induction system or into your intercooler. Now, by nature, because it's being driven by the exhaust is extremely hot. And when I say extremely hot, I mean really hot. You can be talking up to 300°C sometimes. Very common for exhausts to be operating around 220, 250, 270 centigrade, depending on your setup. So that turbo is astronomically hot, which means, again, this is contributing to a problem that you have in summer in Australia with a turbocharged car, in the fact that your charge temps are already going to be high because of the ambient temperature. With the Subaru in particular, you've got a top mount which is not effective necessarily in start-stop traffic, only when you're moving at speed. And on top of that, if you don't have a water spray, you've got nothing to speed up the process of removing that temperature from the intercooler. And then if you've got a turbocharged car, to add insult to injury on top of everything else, the way your intake, your compression on your charge temperatures, or your compression on your charge is done is via the exhaust cycle of your engine anyway, which means all of that ambient temperature in your exhaust is getting radiating across to the compressor side of the turbo, which means that air that is coming out of the turbo is bloody hot. So, I mean, a lot of people who drive turbos will tell you, I've got problems with temperature, engine temperature is a problem, charge temperatures are a problem, because it typically is. If you're running a supercharger, that's less of an issue, because a supercharger is actually charged by mechanical process, not scavenging on the exhaust. So drivers of turbo cars really feel this more than anybody else. So when you're running a high-performance Subaru that's got a top-mount intercooler and a big turbo, you can effectively say on a hot summer's day you're basically going to lose 30, maybe even 40 kilowatts of power, a huge amount. It's also bad for your air-fuel ratios and your engine in general, because your tune is simply not designed to run at such a low amount of air in your cylinder. And you've got to remember that the air in your cylinder changes dramatically with temperature. You know, the colder the air, the more dense the air. So you're going to get a significant increase in the amount of air that you can go into your cylinder, and your tune is built around that. So effectively your tune gets killed on a hot day in summer in Australia when you're running such high charge temperatures. So new technology that's out there. Well, there's a few things that have gone around lately about stuff that'll improve your charge temps, and one that I've found the most interesting is actually what's called a cryocharge system. I found this so interesting, in fact, that I've been researching it, and I've actually spoken to Michael South, my engineer, and we are discussing on how we can design a system for Christina that will take advantage of this technology. So what is cryocharging or what does a cryocharge system do for your engine? What it does is it effectively uses something like CO2 or a compressed gas, sometimes nitrogen or something along those lines, but effectively a compressed gas in a cylinder. When you, like any gas, you know, when you go and fill up some gas into a propane tank, when you go and use one of those little butane cylinders or cans to charge up something or other in the house, whenever you release, or even a can of deodorant, get a can of deodorant, spray it into the air, you'll see that as soon, just simply by spraying that can into the air, the temperature of that can reduces significantly, because compressed gas by nature has had a lot of energy applied to compress the gas. So when you decompress the gas by releasing it to atmosphere, that compressed gas reduces in temperature significantly, because it's getting rid of all of that energy. So compressed gas is a great way of drawing temperature outside of anything, or drawing temperature away from something. That's how refrigerators work. That's how your air compressor in your air conditioning system works. That's why a can of deodorant feels cold when you spray it. So this is all based on the principle that compressed gas draws heat as it is decompressed. So this new system that we've been looking into, Michael and myself, is this cryo system. What it does is actually, you insert a cylinder of CO2 or nitrogen in your car, then you run some piping from that CO2 cylinder into or above the top of your intercooler, and then on there you have a few little nozzles, and what happens is when you press a button on your dashboard, or you can get it to activate with boost, your engine will start to pump compressed gas through this system and out of those little valves, and that valves will put that compressed gas, in this case CO2, and spray that cold compressed gas all over your intercooler. Now you might say, okay, that's great, cold gas on my intercooler, it's not going to last very long. Well, you'd be surprised. I mean, this stuff, you're talking about minus 270 degrees Celsius. This stuff is unbelievably cold. So when you spray it onto your intercooler, you're effectively freezing your intercooler, or turning that metal into an ice block. When you add a water spray system, which I have in my car, on top of that, then you're effectively spraying snow and ice onto your intercooler. And obviously, as you can imagine, you just think of your engine bay running a temperature of 80-90 degrees. For the first couple of seconds that this spray is spraying, it's just going to evaporate straight away. But every second that it's evaporating, it is drawing temperature out of your engine bay. And then it gets to a point where your engine bay temperatures are so low that it's going to hold that ice and actually scag up your intercooler with ice and crystals of ice and snow, because of the mixture of the CO2 or the compressed CO2 being discharged rapidly, and the water spray nozzles coming through your intercooler. Now, with the system that Michael and I are designing, this is a little bit experimental. It is proven to work in race circles, so on a drag track, cryocharging your charge temperatures, or applying a cryocharge system to your race motor in drag racing is done commonly, because that also matters for them. They don't have a radiator, that sort of thing. So reducing those temperatures is significant for them. And this is a very super light, effective way of doing it. Now, obviously the expensive thing is you do need to replace the gas bottle, but that all comes down to how is the system managed. Now, the system that we're designing is going to work on two levels. Number one, it's going to be designed to work in conjunction with the water spray. So what we're trying to do is cool down the air in the intercooler, cool down the surface of the intercooler to the point where when the water spray hits it, it turns into ice immediately. So we get an effective coating of heavy, thick ice all over our intercooler. That's how the system is designed to work. And as that ice melts, it obviously draws temperature out of the system. The ice itself will draw temperature out of the system, and as air passes through, that'll also draw temperature out of the system. So the idea is we use a minimal amount of gas and take maximum advantage of the fact that the water spray is already there, and we're going to utilise the two systems together. The other thing we're designing is a way to deliver it. So we are going to be arming the system with a button on the dashboard, so I can either turn the system on or off. So obviously on a cold winter's day there's no need to be running a cryocharge, but on any hot days, if I need that, or if I'm down at the track or the drags, I can run the cryocharge system and reduce those temperatures immediately and quickly by turning it on. And what we'll also do is that's going to arm the system, and then the way the actual gas will be delivered will be based on boost. So we'll again hook a vacuum line up. As soon as the engine comes on boost, the cryocharge system will be active and it will start dumping gas out onto the intercooler. So that's how we're designing the system. That's how we hope it works. In theory, it's definitely going to work. As far as I know, I spoke to Michael about it quite a bit over the last week or so. We're designing the system together. I think it'll be effective. Michael is a fantastic engineer, so I'm sure he'll do a great job. If things go horribly wrong and everything gets fucked up, well then I guess that's my bad, and I'll have to buy a new intercooler. That's not the cheapest thing in the world, but if anything's going to fail, I'd rather the intercooler fail than the engine. And there's no way the engine will fail, because we're going to be reducing charge temps, not increasing them. And it's working on a compressed gas system, which means, and it's an inert compressed gas, so it's not flammable. CO2 is effectively a fire extinguisher. So if anything, it's quite a safe mod to be doing. Alright, so that about wraps it up for today. I hope you liked today's blog. I'm going to go in there and get Jan's Chinese and enjoy that this evening. I appreciate you all watching the video, and I'll see you all on the other side.